While it's recently been superseded by an all-new and fully redesigned model, there's still quite a large amount of unsold retail inventory of today's Victim, indicating that it might not have sold quite as well as its manufacturer intended. Joining Acer's Nitro V15 in this odd category of supercharged office laptops, this is Lenovo's original Essential series. I guess that's meant to be LOQ.
Well, this is kind of awkward. It's actually pronounced lock, or L-OQ. L-O-Q? LOQ? Lucky boy, that's the one.
Thanks,
Jared.
Despite Lenovo's initial attempt to price this thing higher than the vastly superior entry-level model it was meant to replace, we got our hands on this machine for the rock-bottom price of $799 Australian dollars brand new. Yes, that's right, this gaming laptop would have just about qualified price-wise for our recent Potato Party series, and it came complete with an interesting HX series Core i5, RTX 3050 6GB GPU, and a 0.5TB SSD. It's no secret that this model is full of nasty surprises for the uninitiated, so this one's going to be interesting. Lenovo's pitch for this laptop has always been marred by the confusing and misleading naming scheme. A LOQ15 Gen 9 is a proper, bespoke gaming laptop with a large dual-fan cooling system and Legion-like design. Unfortunately, Lenovo have decided to also name this thing a LOQ15 Gen 9, so the inclusion of the word essential in the title does a hell of a lot of heavy lifting. Fundamentally, the LOQ Essential is a typical all-plastic 15-inch laptop with a drop hinge at the rear, ports on the left and right, and a standard keyboard and trackpad layout inside. This machine is so typical, in fact, that you'd have a very hard time playing spot the difference between one of these and anything else in Lenovo's low-grade IdeaPad 1 and 3 series. The only real external difference is a thicker D-case assembly which provides clearance for the heavier-duty cooling system. Other than that, this really is just a slightly thickened IdeaPad 3 with LOQ branding on the lid, so while it's a generally sane and inoffensive design, it's littered with typical cheap laptop irritations like a multitude of rough unfinished edges and a generally weak and creaky assembly. In common with its IdeaPad stablemates, the LOQ is very compact, and at 1.8 kilograms, it's surprisingly lightweight too. The hinges are wound up tight enough to require 848 grams of force to lift from fully closed, despite the lack of any magnets clamping it shut. Movement either way from a 90-degree angle takes a reduced force of 331 grams. However, while that's the amount it takes to move the actual hinges, the assembly as a whole is annoyingly floppy and will deflect as much as 3 centimeters in both directions before the hinge angle is affected. Taking a look from inside, starting underneath the keyboard deck, you can see that we've got fairly small stamped steel hinge brackets on both sides, extending an unimpressive distance of 4 centimeters into the chassis on the left-hand side and a laughably short distance of 2 centimeters on the right-hand side. And disappointingly, these only use 3 screws each to anchor them to the fragile ABS plastic structure. While there's some extra lateral bracing provided by bolting these brackets through the adjacent motherboard and daughter board on each side, because printed circuit boards just love being load-bearing components, there's very little in the way of reassuring structures here, and in my experience as a repairer, I'd say I can see many points of failure in these areas alone. A solid bump in a backpack would likely be all it took to yank some of these screw bosses out or crack their standoffs, leaving you with a potentially hefty repair bill. Now, having a look inside the display assembly, behind the lower bezel, well, anyone who's seen our IdeaPad Slim 1 review probably knew exactly what to expect in here, and it's not great. The hinge is directly bolted into the fragile plastic lid via too few screws that are too small and all too close to the leading edge, concentrating a huge amount of force over a small area. The lightweight hinge assemblies themselves have some utterly useless floppy little support brackets attached which clip in on each side at the top of the lid, but these are incredibly flexible and will do absolutely nothing for structural integrity. I'll be blunt here, this is all rubbish, and you should not buy one of these machines expecting any sort of durability. If you already have one, just note that you need to be very gentle opening and closing the display and avoid subjecting it to any shocks during transport. Temporarily held up by that flaky structure is a 144Hz IPS type LCD. You never really know what to expect from displays in cheap gaming machines, but thankfully in this case Lenovo has delivered, if only just. This panel covers just under 100% of the sRGB gamut, contrast is just under 1100 to 1, and brightness after calibration is just about 300 nits. These figures are all centered around what I consider the bare minimum for an acceptable display, so while it's hit every target, it hasn't really exceeded a single one. I guess this is what it looks like when an LCD panel is quiet quitting. Relatable. Nonetheless, this is a completely usable panel, and with an absence of any distracting motion blur or IPS glow issues, I'd say overall this one is a win. There's a general agreement going around that Lenovo makes decent keyboards, but you wouldn't know it from this one. This keyboard has short travel, minimal feedback, unstable keys, and just like the IdeaPad 1, the keybed feels as if it's mounted just a bit too deep into the case, so you'll regularly bump the lattice between the keys while typing, which is a novel and quite unpleasant feeling. Other than a thin and floppy sheet of aluminium spanning the width of the top case, there's almost no real structure in this area, so the keyboard deck bends like a banana under pressure, with the most fragile area being just below the spacebar. On top of all of that, you'll find that most of these machines ship without a keyboard backlight, so gaming in the dark is a frustrating exercise in hunting for the right key during critical moments. I would suggest that a backlit keyboard is essential on any laptop, and especially on a gaming laptop, so this is one of the many things that really call that essential branding into question. The trackpad fitted to this machine has an excellent, albeit plastic, tracking surface and very accurate movement, and that's where the compliments end. The assembly rattles like crazy during use, and the palm rest area noticeably caves in when the integrated button is activated. This pointing device is completely usable but completely unpleasant. Connectivity on this machine is everything you'd expect and nothing you wouldn't, right down to the inclusion of the exact same SD card reader found in cheaper IdeaPads. None of the USB ports are slower than USB 3.2 Gen 1, there's a full-size RJ45 Ethernet jack, and thankfully Lenovo have continued using a dedicated DC in jack to reduce wear on the Type-C ports. On that note, aside from a single USB Type-A and the SD card reader, all ports are soldered directly to the mainboard, so if you damage any of these, repair is a complex and risky procedure. The 57.5 watt-hour battery is reporting a full 57 watt-hours after calibrating over a few charge cycles. At idle, sitting on the desktop with the display set to 300 nits of brightness and set to its balanced power mode, the machine lasted a very silly 4 hours and 17 minutes, and a much more reasonable but still disappointing 3 hours during our heavy internet use test. The LOQ Essential draws a surprisingly high 18 watts from the wall at idle, which seems to be a result of not fully shutting down the NVIDIA GPU when it's not in use. This is exactly the sort of thing that will vary between operating systems or with driver or BIOS updates over time, but it's worth noting for now. Charging from empty, the battery takes 41 minutes to hit 50%, 1 hour and 7 minutes to hit 80%, and then it's full after 2 hours and 5 minutes, almost exactly the time Lenovo specifies. Once it wears out, that battery is easy to replace, being held in by only 3 screws and no adhesive, although you will have to battle through Torx screws and fragile, excessively tight clips to get the rear case off. Audio I/O is provided by the now familiar Realtek ALC3287 chip, which is one of the models I'm unable to find a datasheet for, so we're not 100% clear on specs. Lenovo rates the internal speakers at 2 watts per channel, however, that could mean just about anything without any further information. The included speakers are a very typical pair of the ubiquitous crappy little oval drivers, and they're mounted in tiny little boxes on either side of the case, firing downwards underneath the left and right palm rests. As always with these setups, audio is tinny when the laptop is sitting on a desk and muffled and quiet when it's on your lap or another soft surface. The included SSD is a tiny little Samsung BM9C1 in the M22242 form factor for some reason. This PCIe 4 drive uses 512GB worth of Samsung QLC NAND flash and a Samsung Piccolo controller which lacks support for DRAM cache. Read speeds aren't bad for a small SSD, but write speeds are well below what you'd expect from a modern system. Bizarrely, while this machine has 2 available SSD slots, neither of them supports the common 2280 size drives. Even more bizarrely, while the included drive is attached with the usual SSD screw, Lenovo have gone for an odd little soldered on clip for the other 2 M2 slots. I'm not really sure what the general thought process is here, but okay. On that note, the wireless is provided by a socketed Intel AX203 chipset which supports Wi-Fi 6, not 6E, and Bluetooth 5.2. 2 antennas are located at the leading edge of the palm rest instead of where they belong up high in the lid, so reception is not the best in this one. Moving on to the more serious components, well, would you check out the size of this package? That's a full-blown Intel HX CPU, which in typical, less cost-optimized applications would mean an ultra-high wattage CPU intended for workstations and hardcore gaming machines. Here though, it's a lowly Core i5-12450HX, which means we've got 4 Golden Cove performance cores with hyperthreading and 4 Gracemont E cores sharing a total of 12 megabytes of cache. In theory, this chip is rated for anywhere between 55 and 157 watts, but that's all completely meaningless, as you'll see in just a moment. That chonker of a CPU supports DDR5 memory in dual channel, but Lenovo have thoroughly gimped this machine by only providing a single DDR5 slot, so theoretical memory bandwidth is permanently halved. What the hell? Included in this configuration, then, is a single 16GB stick of Samsung DDR5 5600 CL46 RAM, which is throttled down to 4800MHz since that's the highest speed this CPU supports. There's a bit of a theme here, isn't there? Absolutely dwarfed by the massive i5 is the tiny little baby NVIDIA GeForce RTX 3050 6GB GPU. This GPU is based on NVIDIA's Ampere architecture and built on Samsung's 8nm process. As with so many other components these days, this GPU is confusingly named as it shares its basic specs, such as the CUDA core ROP and TMU counts, with the RTX 3050 Ti laptop GPU, but it trades that part's 128-bit memory bus for a narrower 96-bit bus attached to 6GB of DDR6 VRAM. In theory, this is not a terrible entry-level GPU, but that 6GB frame buffer is only going to become more of a problem as time passes. Tasked with expelling heat from the two chips is what could generously be called half a cooler. Completely disregarding convention, Lenovo have simply doubled the heat pipes and widened the fan on the exact same basic single-fan cooling design they fit into all the more basic laptops in the IdeaPad range. Heat is extracted from the chip's VRM components and video memory via a mixture of copper and nickel-plated aluminium cold plates, each of which has a reasonable finish with fairly minimal pitting, but both have discolored pretty heavily already, indicating there's some sort of reaction going on with that thermal compound. A 45mm fan, which Lenovo creatively refers to as a 100mm fan, breathes air in from the bottom of the case and blows it out just in front of the hinge via a single small heat exchanger. Weighing in at only 135 grams without the fan, this cooler is just about as light duty as these things get, and it tells us this machine is probably going to be hot, loud, or low on power delivery. So on that note, we've subjected this machine to several full load stress tests over 30 minutes to see how the power delivery and cooling cope under harsh conditions. For all the following tests, the machine is sitting flat on the desk running Ubuntu 25.04 with NVIDIA Open Kernel Driver 575 and set to its high performance power mode with NVIDIA Dynamic Boost enabled. Testing is carried out before the machine is dismantled to avoid any changes introduced by repasting the cooler, and we have confirmed that the power delivery and cooling performance is completely identical between Linux and Windows 11. Firstly, loading up just the CPU on its own in an ambient temperature of 20 degrees Celsius, power spikes up to 70 watts before rapidly dropping to 45, where it sticks like glue for the remainder of the test. 45 watts is the rated power for an H-class CPU, not an HX like the one we have here, so right away this is very disappointing. The basic cooler has no trouble dissipating that 45 watt heat load, so after a brief spike the core temperatures drop down to the low 70s. P-core clock is disappointing from start to finish, only briefly blipping up to 3.8 GHz before dropping all the way to a perfectly stable 3 GHz. At this point, you might be wondering why Lenovo have bothered with the HX CPU at all. Good question. With the GPU loaded up, again on its own with the CPU at idle, GPU power immediately jumps up to 62 watts and pretty much sticks to it like glue for the full 30 minutes. Lenovo have rated this GPU at up to 65 watts, and it can occasionally hit that mark using Dynamic Boost, but for whatever reason it's decided 62 is the magic number here. I think it's safe to say that that cooler is still well within its limits coping with 62 watts of heat, because after a brief spike before the fan spins up, the temperature gently wafts up to a perfectly cromulent 70 degrees before leveling off. Given close to its full 65 watts and staying well within temperature limits, the little 3050 clocks to just on 1500 MHz with almost no deviations. Now, with both chips loaded up at the same time for a worst case scenario heat load at the same 20 degree ambient temperature, the CPU is now starved of some power by NVIDIA Dynamic Boost, maxing out at a sustained 32 watts. CPU core temperatures are heading a little higher now, slowly wafting up towards 75 as the test goes on. Now, the effect of this reduced power on P-core clocks is pretty much cataclysmic, with the cores now dropped to just on 2 GHz for this test. Interestingly, it seems as if the CPU cores are being regulated by frequency and not power, since there's absolutely no deviation from precisely 2 GHz here. Under this combined load, the GPU is only receiving around 43 watts, so we can now assert that the maximum combined power of this system is exactly 75 watts, which seems reasonable given the limited cooling system in this machine. The GPU temperature is still under control, slowly rising from 70 before leveling off at 72 degrees by the 30-minute mark. Given that lower power limit, the 3050 is now only sustaining a clock speed of just under 1300 MHz, which is close to 500 lower than its theoretical peak speed. Now, since those tests were carried out at an ambient temperature of 20 degrees, you might be wondering how badly this system would cope on a hot day, so we've run the combined load test again at an ambient temperature of 30 degrees, again for the full 30-minute period. Cooking away in a hot office, the CPU is once again happily sticking to its 32 watt power limit, so we're still operating within safe limits. Nonetheless, the core temperatures are getting noticeably higher now, and there's a constant drift up towards 80 degrees over time. Predictably enough, the P cores are still stubbornly sticking to 2 GHz since we've still got nearly 20 degrees of headroom before they start throttling down due to heat. Just like the CPU, the GPU's power delivery isn't affected by the high ambient temperature, still happily sitting at its fairly arbitrary 43 watts for the full 30 minutes. However, just like the CPU, the core temperature is noticeably higher now and it's slowly increasing all the way to the 30-minute mark, topping out at 78 degrees. Despite the power delivery being identical, you can see that we're now starting to gradually lose more clock speed over time. This is a result of the increased temperature in the chip causing a gradual decrease in efficiency, so while it's initially hovering around 1200 MHz, the GPU has clocked down to 1100 by the end of the test and it looks like it's still dropping. So overall, we're giving this machine's cooler a pass at 20 degrees, but since it's very obviously starting to lose control of the GPU temperature at 30 degrees ambient, we're calling that test a fail. Due to the fact that the fan and heat spread are on the right-hand side of the machine, meaning the two high wattage chips are on the left, heat is concentrated around the top left of the keyboard, right where you're using the WASD keys. Temperatures in this area reach a very unpleasant 43 to 44 degrees, right where you're making contact with the keyboard the most, which is wildly uncomfortable and distracting during gameplay. I'd suggest that a comfortable gaming experience is part of what you consider essential, so we are really questioning Lenovo's definition of that word at this point. Since this is a gaming laptop, we're obviously going to run through a few gaming benchmarks, and we've split these into two sections with different intents: relative performance and realistic experience. Firstly, to place this laptop into easily understood context, we'll show you the performance compared to a common desktop gaming PC and a typical mid-range laptop with an integrated GPU. The desktop PC was built to match the most common configuration based on Steam's hardware survey as of mid-2025, a 6-core CPU, 16GB of RAM, and an RTX 4060 graphics card. For the laptop with integrated graphics, we're using Lenovo's IdeaPad Slim 5 equipped with a Ryzen 7 8845HS running at 55 watts and 32GB of DDR5 memory. Performance figures are taken at 1080p resolution with graphics set on a game-by-game basis, aiming for a rough target of 80 frames per second on the gaming PC. At these standardized settings, it's pretty clear where this machine sits relative to the most common gaming PC configuration, disappointingly only around half of the performance when set to the same completely reasonable settings. I think it's fair to say that the 3050 has outstayed its welcome in this class of machine, but of course in this case, whatever performance it could have offered is being strangled by the low power budget and resulting low boost clocks. When that little GPU isn't in the way, the heavily power throttled CPU choked with single channel RAM takes over as the major performance bottleneck, which really is the opposite of what you'd expect from an HX branded chip. Overall, being so far behind our reference desktop, which itself is a thoroughly mediocre performer, I'd say this is a very poor showing and barely qualifies this machine as a gaming laptop if it does at all. Of course, in the real world, you'd be matching game graphics settings sensibly to your hardware, so let's see how this system copes using more realistic settings. Even at a measly 1080p, Assassin's Creed Valhalla needs to be set to low in order to keep resource usage under control and maintain 60 FPS. But at these settings, it does run very smoothly, and this would make for a perfectly playable experience. Still, I think this one looks pretty bad on low, so ideally you'd want to aim for stronger hardware for the best experience here. I've spent quite a bit of time playing Borderlands 3 on this specific machine since I decided to do another playthrough of the previous titles before the new game came out, no comment, and I can say with some certainty that this one runs like butter on the medium preset, constantly getting between 70 and 90 FPS and making for a very competent gaming experience as long as you're okay with your left hand being cooked for a couple of hours at a time. Predictably enough, in Cyberpunk 2077, there's no escaping the low preset at a native 1080p, and I will continue to insist that this game looks like crap if you use any upscaler at this resolution on a 15-inch screen. Combined with high crowds, which is required to avoid breaking the immersion of a bustling city, the lock puts in a bit of a wobbly performance spanning the 40 to 60 frame per second range, but overall, I'd say this is a completely playable experience, albeit with some noticeable input lag, and of course, a further drop in performance in Dogtown if you're playing the Phantom Liberty expansion. At a native 1080p in Dying Light 2, even the very low preset isn't enough to hold on to 60 FPS, which is wildly disappointing. This game is still perfectly playable, but the parkour mechanics in this one really benefit from a higher frame rate, feeling increasingly janky the further you drop below 60. We're only using half of the available VRAM on these settings, so this one is completely hung up on the low performance GPU. Now, the headline feature of Grand Theft Auto 5 Enhanced is, of course, its comprehensive ray tracing upgrade, and in this case, the little 3050 does a great job easily hanging on to 60 frames per second on the high RT setting, with very smooth frame times and no issues with input lag. You might even get away with higher settings if you were happy to enable an upscaler, although RT is very heavy on VRAM, so you'd probably hit a bit of a wall pretty quickly. Guardians of the Galaxy is remarkably heavy on VRAM, but with 6 gigs available at 1080p on low settings, the little 3050 just about squeaks out a playable frame rate. This game is just about useless on 4GB GPUs, so that upgrade to 6 makes all the difference here, although since it's still right on the limit, it's likely to run into anything from micro stutters to massive frame time spikes after you've been playing for a while. So, overall, what do we make of the LOQ 15 Essential? Well, the display is decent. Moving on to the negatives, almost every single downside that plagued the IdeaPad 1 also applies to the LOQ Essential, and then it piles on a few new ones all its own. This is a shabby entry-level laptop with some expensive parts shoehorned in and a misleading name slapped on the box to shift a few units to unsuspecting buyers. All things considered then, this one is joining its little brother in receiving an official rating of complete crap. Avoid. If you're new here, you should go check out another one of our unique laptop reviews, and for everyone else, I'll see you again soon.